Silence is compliance, and Black lives matter. And it's funny to think that even though slavery is illegal in the United States, somehow state sanctioned violence and oppression is still legal in the United States. And 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 to think that white people have always had this overarching power over other races and will continue having this overarching power, which then somehow leads us to this state sanctioned violence and oppression against groups who identify as minorities, and more specifically, the Black communities. And I know we hear this every day, and yet somehow we lose sight of the 13th Amendment altogether. Do you know what the 13th Amendment is? So state sanctioned violence and oppression is when there are legal laws that are completely legal, obviously, but on the other hand, they're just deemed very wrong. And so an example is like discrimination is obviously illegal, but the inequalities which occur, which lead to discrimination, are completely legal within the United States. And as a person of color who identifies as a person of color, I understand what it feels like that even though it's not complete discrimination, which is illegal, I know what it feels like for my human rights to be slipped out of my hands because of a person, because of their skin tone, has more power than me, right? Just like the police interaction talk that I've had to have more times than I can count on my 10 fingers, completely legal because I know that I'm always going to be the one who's one step lower with a white person in front of me. And and so today I want to talk about how there are laws within our country which are completely legal, although they are deemed wrong, um, in order to take advantage of those who identify as minorities, and specifically who identify within the Black community. And for today, we're going to stick with state-sanctioned violence and oppression within law enforcement, because law enforcement, they're given the right and the power to take any measures necessary to keep our country safe, which then somehow leads to institutionalized racism within law enforcement interactions against unarmed Black men and women, and within segregation of communities. And so to talk about my first point of institutionalized racism within law enforcement interactions, when when law enforcement gets a 911 call, the first thing that they ask you is the race of the subject that you are calling about. And so when you say, yes, this person is a Black male or Black female, they've already had this like underlying prejudice and bias created before they even walk there, show up at the scene. And so they come already waiting, ready to use force. And which leads to the Black community having more violent run-ins with police, and then finding themselves in ethnic divides, and then becoming slaves once again within the prison, and privatized prisons, and then in jail within law enforcement, due to state-sanctioned violence and oppression. So, for example, of this ethnic divide is the Central Park Five. And if you don't know who they are five teenagers who were wrongfully convicted and had to sit in adult prison for 6 to 8 years for a crime that they didn't do. And there's this divide because although they were wrongfully convicted, they were wrongfully convicted with the people who were supposed to serve and protect us within the Black community, and we lost sight of that. And then an example of the violent run-ins is close to me in my hometown. There were four minors who were driving a car that looked like a runaway car. And so the police pulled over these four minors, all under the age of 18, handcuffed them, and held them at gunpoint against the floor without the right to call their parents, which no under 18-year-old should have to ever run into. And then in talking about prisons and the underlying slavery that's happening within privatized prisons is a whole different story. According to the article "Racial and Ethnic Divides in Privatized Punishment" by Andrea Montes, Daniel Mears, and Eric Stewart, published on March 6, 2019, the following statistic was found during their study of privatized prisons, which is that Black males are 6 times more likely than white men to be incarcerated, while Black women are 2 times more likely than white female women to be incarcerated. And the craziest thing is that Blacks are more likely to be put in privatized prisons due to their crime in order to increase the economy for the prisons, which help the government in return, to help, was originally put there to help for the loss of economics in the Civil War. Which brings me to my second point of institutionalized racism against unarmed Black men and women. And according to the article named Killing Us Softly, written by Charles F. Davis, published on December 6, 2019, one in every 1,000 black men risk death resulting from police use of force over their lifetime, which is 2.5 times higher than white men. And it's funny to think that because you're wearing a dark colored hoodie or black hoodie and you have your hands in your pocket and your skin tone is not white, this gives the okay for a person of the black community to die, which is totally completely not right. And according to Institutionalized Racism and State-Sanctioned Violence, written by the Legal Action Center, published May 27th of 2020, Ahmaud Arbery's murder in Glenn County, Breonna Taylor's killing in Louisville, and George Floyd's killing in Minneapolis are all over examples of state-sanctioned violence. And my final point is institutionalized racism within segregation of communities. And the first community I'd like to talk to you about today is education. And since slavery, there has been a reality that Black Americans experience subtle and discrimination from preschool all the way to college. And in the article by Kevin Oakley, what it means to be Black in higher education, published on December 16, 2019, biases in schools include cultural insensitivity, disproportionately harsh discipline, lower teacher expectations, tracking of Black students into special education and remedial classes, diminishes the enthusiasm and motivation for school, which makes it harder for Black people to go to school and make it to higher education. And talking about the living communities, according to Ethan Siegel in his article named How America is Breaking Public Education, published on December 11, 2017, families who identify as Black are placed in impoverished communities, which then leads to gentrification. And although gentrification is not illegal, it's just wrong that you should kick communities out of their homes for building of profits of businesses. Now, I could go on and on about different state-sanctioned violence and oppression occurrences within the United States, which exist, that are completely legal, although they are very wrong, but I'd be here all day, and I do not have all day. State-sanctioned violence and oppression occurs all over the world and is way too present within our government. And there are laws within our country which allow those in power to take advantage of those who identify as minorities, and more specifically for today, the Black community. Today, we talked about institutionalized racism within law enforcement interactions against unarmed Black men and women, and within segregation of communities. And what can you do now that you know all this information? We as citizens of this country, we have an obligation to make our voices heard. We are the ones to make the impact that matters most. And to learn more about state-sanctioned violence and oppression present in our country, I recommend that you watch Netflix's documentary 13th, which is very good. And from today until the rest of your life, I encourage you to embrace your diversity, show empathy, actively accept other communities, and show compassion.